Close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember the quiet hum of the old, rounded refrigerator standing in the corner of your childhood kitchen. Can you smell the deep, sweet aroma of sugar slowly melting in a tablespoon over an open gas flame? Can you feel the rough texture of a crust of black rye bread in your hands, still warm from the local bakery? Today, we are going back to a time when our pockets were empty, but our hearts and stomachs were remarkably full. We are returning to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. We are going to remember 20 simple, incredibly cheap foods we ate when there was absolutely no money. Foods that defined an entire generation. Stay with me until the very end, because the final memory we will share is perhaps the most touching, tear-jerking treat of them all, one that will instantly transport you back to your Mother Us kitchen table. Before we dive into these beautiful memories, let us pause and think about how time itself felt back then. It flowed so much slower. We did not rush. We knew the value of waiting, whether it was standing in line for basic groceries or patiently watching water boil on a small stove in a tiny Khrushchevka apartment. Modern people often look back and think we lived in poverty because our store shelves were not filled with hundreds of colourful boxes. But they do not understand that our emotional lives were incredibly rich. Our kitchens were small, often shared in communal apartments, but they were the centre of our universe. It was there, amidst the clinking of faceted glasses and the warm glow of a single hanging bulb, that real human connections were forged. We did not have the internet to distract us, so we talked. We shared what little we had. The food we ate was not just fuel. It was a testament to the incredible ingenuity of our mothers and grandmothers, who could create absolute masterpieces out of nothing but flour, water, salt, and immense love. We were not poor, we were rich in ways that today us world has forgotten. Let us start with perhaps the most iconic taste of a 1960s Soviet childhood. Imagine a thick slice of dense, dark rye bread. We called it black bread, and the best part was always the heel. The crusty end we affectionately called the gorbushka. When money was tight and the cupboards were bare, this was our ultimate street snack. You would take that rough slice and drizzle it generously with unrefined sunflower oil. Not the pale, tasteless oil of today, but the thick, dark, golden liquid that smelled intensely of roasted seeds. Then you would sprinkle coarse, greyish salt over the top. The salt crystals would crunch loudly between your teeth, perfectly balancing the earthy tang of the rye and the rich, nutty aroma of the oil. You would run out into the courtyard with this treasure in your hand, taking massive bites while playing catch or hide and seek. Sometimes a friend would ask for a bite, and sharing that simple slice of oiled bread forged bonds stronger than blood. It cost absolutely pennies, yet the combination of those three simple ingredients created a symphony of flavour that no expensive modern delicacy can ever replicate. And now, let us remember another legendary variation of that same black bread, one that served as both a delicious treat and a powerful medicine. When the brutal winter winds began to howl outside the double-paned windows, our grandmothers knew exactly what to do. You would take that same crusty heel of rye bread and a single peeled clove of fresh garlic. The hard, baked crust acted perfectly like a natural grater. You would rub the garlic fiercely against the rough surface of the bread until the clove almost completely disappeared, melting into the crust. The sharp, spicy oils of the garlic would soak into the porous bread, releasing an aroma that fills the entire kitchen. We believed with all our hearts that this was the ultimate cure for any impending cold or flu. You would eat it alongside a steaming bowl of simple potato soup, or just entirely on its own. The garlic would burn your tongue slightly, bringing tears to your eyes, but the savoury, intense flavour was incredibly addictive. It was the taste of a grandmother's fierce, protective love, wrapped up in the cheapest ingredients imaginable. As for sweet treats, our imaginations transformed the simplest staples into royal desserts. Think back to a slice of fresh, soft white bread. You would carefully spread a layer of butter over it. The butter had to be just the right temperature, soft enough to glide smoothly over the crumb without tearing it. And then came the magic touch. You would take a spoonful of granulated white sugar and sprinkle it evenly over the butter. The sugar crystals would stick to the fat, creating a brilliant, sparkling layer that looked just like the first winter snow. When you took a bite, the contrast of textures was absolute perfection. First, the soft, pillowy bread, then the rich, creamy butter melting on your tongue, and finally, the loud, satisfying crunch of the sweet sugar. This was our Soviet cake. It was the dessert we requested when friends came over to play. A sweet luxury that required no baking, no expensive ingredients, and no waiting. Just pure, immediate joy, captured in a single, sugary slice of bread. Speaking of sugar, there is a specific smell that instantly transports anyone who grew up in the 1970s straight back to childhood. It is the slightly sharp caramel aroma of burning sugar. When we begged for candy and there was absolutely no money to buy it, we took matters into our own hands. We would take a large, heavy metal tablespoon, fill it to the brim with white sugar, add a single drop of water and hold it directly over the blue flame of the gas stove. You had to watch it like a hawk. Slowly, the white crystals would begin to melt, turning into a bubbling, clear liquid, and then magically transforming into a rich, golden amber color. If you waited just a second too long, it would burn and turn bitter, filling the apartment with smoke. But if you caught it perfectly, you would carefully drop a matchstick without the sulfur head into the spoon, creating a makeshift handle, and leave it to cool. We called them petushki, our homemade lollipops. Pulling that hard, glassy caramel candy off the spoon and burning your tongue because you were too impatient to let it cool completely is a memory permanently etched into our souls. Let us move away from the kitchen for a moment and step into the crisp autumn air. Nothing tastes quite like freedom and adventure as much as potatoes baked entirely in the ashes of a dying campfire. During the harvest season, when families went to the dacha to dig up the winter supply of potatoes, a bonfire was always lit to burn the dry leaves and potato stalks. When the flames died down, leaving a bed of glowing, incredibly hot red embers, we would bury small, unpeeled potatoes deep inside the ashes. Waiting for them to cook felt like an eternity. When they were finally ready, we would poke them out with a long stick. They were completely black, covered in thick soot. You would toss the scorching hot potato from one hand to the other, blowing on it frantically to avoid burning your fingers. Then you would break it in half. The contrast between the charred, blackened skin and the steaming, snowy white flesh inside was beautiful. A tiny pinch of salt was all it needed. We ate them right there in the field, our faces and hands covered in black ash, laughing together under the grey autumn sky. Next is a memory that carries both the sweetness of a rare dessert and the thrill of absolute danger. I am talking about boiling a tin can of condensed milk. Today you can simply buy boiled condensed milk in any store, but back then, creating this delicacy was a serious multi-hour operation. You would place the sealed tin can in a large pot of water on the stove and let it boil for 3 or 4 hours. The golden rule was that the can must always be completely submerged. If the water boiled away and the can was exposed, the pressure would build and the can would explode with the force of a bomb, painting the entire kitchen ceiling with sticky, boiling hot caramel. Every child heard terrifying stories of the exploding condensed milk. But when it was done correctly and you finally opened that cooled tin, the reward was spectacular. The white, milky liquid had transformed into a thick, dark brown, incredibly rich caramel paste. Eating it straight from the can with a teaspoon, scraping the ribbed metal sides to get every last drop, was a moment of pure, uninterrupted bliss. For a savoury memory, let us recall the absolute king of the Soviet frying pan. When there was no fresh meat to be found and money was stretched to the limit, we relied on a simple stick of boiled bologna, affectionately known as Dr. Us sausage. Eaten cold, it was fine, but fried, it became something legendary. You would cut thick, round slices and throw them into a hot pan with just a tiny bit of butter or oil. As the sausage heated up, a magical transformation occurred. The edges of the slice would begin to lift and curl upward, turning the flat circle into a little pink, savoury bowl. The bottom would develop a crispy, dark brown crust that was packed with salty flavour. We would often fill the little well of the sausage bowl with mashed potatoes or green peas. The smell of frying sausage floating down the staircase of a block of flats meant someone was having a fantastic dinner. It was cheap, it was filling, and that crispy fried edge is a texture that still makes our mouths water decades later. Sometimes the best meals were born purely out of the necessity of not throwing anything away. Imagine a large aluminium pot sitting in the fridge filled with plain boiled macaroni from yesterday US dinner. Cold, stiff, and stuck together in a giant lump. Most people today might throw it out, but our grandmothers knew the secret of the second life of pasta. They would heat a heavy cast iron skillet, melt a generous chunk of butter, and toss that block of cold macaroni right into the pan. You would press it down with a spatula and let it sit there, sizzling loudly. We did not want to just warm it up, we wanted to fry it. We waited until the pasta turned a deep golden brown and developed a hard, incredibly crunchy crust. The edges of the macaroni would become sharp and caramelized from the butter. Served with a sprinkle of sugar for the kids, or just heavily salted, crispy fried pasta was not a leftover meal. It was an entirely new, beloved dish. Scraping the burnt bits off the bottom of the heavy pan was always the best part of the evening. Now, let us look to the windowsill of that tiny kitchen. There, in the filtered sunlight, stood a large 3-litre glass jar covered with a piece of white medical gauze secured by a rubber band. Inside floated something that looked like an alien creature, a thick, layered, slippery brown disc. We called it the tea mushroom, though today the rest of the world knows it as kombucha. When there was no money for sweet sodas or lemonade, this jar was our continuous source of joy. Every week, our mothers would brew strong black tea, dissolve a generous amount of sugar in it, let it cool, and pour it gently over the mushroom to feed it. In return, the mushroom fermented the liquid into a sharp, fizzy, incredibly refreshing drink. Pouring a cold glass of that tangy, slightly sweet, naturally carbonated tea on a sweltering hot summer day felt like a miracle. We treated that mushroom like a family pet, dividing its layers and sharing them with neighbours in smaller glass jars, spreading a living, bubbling network of friendship throughout the entire apartment building. Breakfast memories often revolve around a dish that divided children into two camps: semolina porridge or manna kasha. It was cheap, filling, and a staple of every Soviet household and kindergarten. The absolute worst fear of any child was finding those dreaded gummy white lumps floating in the bowl. But a skilled grandmother knew how to whisk it perfectly smooth. To make it truly special, when butter was scarce, they would rely on the jars of preserves hidden in the pantry. They would serve the steaming white porridge on a wide, shallow plate, and right in the centre, they would drop a generous spoonful of thick, homemade strawberry or raspberry jam. As the heat of the porridge warmed the jam, the bright red syrup would slowly bleed into the pristine white semolina. We would use our spoons to draw patterns, creating red rivers and lakes, slowly mixing the sweet fruit into the hot porridge. It turned a mundane, cheap breakfast into a colourful, sweet canvas that warmed us to our bones before the long walk to school in the freezing snow. Sometimes the greatest treats required no cooking at all. When the sweet tooth ached and the candy bowl was empty, we turned to the root vegetables stored on the balcony. You would take a large, bright orange carrot, wash it thoroughly, and pull out the heavy metal box grater. The sound of grating the raw carrot was loud and rhythmic, echoing through the small kitchen. You would pile the fluffy, finely shredded carrot into a glass bowl and sprinkle a heavy dose of white sugar over it. If you were lucky, maybe you would grate a tart green apple into it as well. Then the most important step, you had to wait. You let it sit for 10 or 15 minutes until the sugar drew out the natural juices of the carrot, creating a sweet, bright orange syrup at the bottom of the bowl. Eating that fresh, crunchy, incredibly sweet mixture was a delight. But the true prize was at the very end. Tilting the bowl to drink that sugary, earthy carrot juice straight from the rim was a moment of pure, vibrant joy in the middle of a grey, freezing winter. Let us recall another brilliant way nothing was ever wasted in a Soviet kitchen. Stale bread was never, ever thrown in the garbage. That was considered an unforgivable sin by generations who remembered real hunger. Instead, leftover bread was cut into small cubes or slices and dried on top of the cast iron radiators, turning into rock-hard croutons we called sukhari. On a cold, lonely evening, when there was no cake or cookies, we would pour a mug of piping hot, deeply brewed black tea and stir in 2 spoonfuls of sugar. Then came the delicate art of the dunk. You would take a rock-hard piece of dried bread and hold it in the hot, sweet tea. The timing had to be absolutely flawless. If you pulled it out too soon, it would break your teeth. If you held it a second too long, the soaked bread would break off and fall to the bottom of the mug in a mushy disaster. But when you timed it perfectly, the bread became warm, sweet, and soft on the outside, while maintaining a slight bite in the center. It was a meditation. A quiet evening ritual of comfort that cost nothing at all. Now, let us remember a street food that defined the social life of an entire generation. It is impossible to imagine a courtyard in the 1970s without the familiar sight of a neighborhood grandmother sitting on a small wooden stool selling roasted sunflower seeds. You would hand over 10 or 15 kopecks, and she would carefully pour the hot, fragrant seeds from a small faceted glass into a cone made from yesterday US newspaper. We called that cone a kulek. The smell of those freshly roasted seeds, slightly oily and perfectly salted, is the true perfume of our youth. You would sit on a wooden bench with your friends, your fingers turning dark from the newspaper ink and the roasted shells. The process of cracking the seeds with your teeth was automatic, a rhythmic ritual that accompanied endless conversations about life, first loves, and dreams of the future. We did not have smartphones to keep our hands busy. We had these warm little newspaper cones. Today, you can buy seeds in shiny plastic bags at any supermarket, but they lack the magic of that simple time. For a truly festive feeling on a zero budget, our mothers performed culinary miracles. The famous kartoshka, or potato cake, is a masterpiece of making something out of nothing. It was not made of actual potatoes, but named for its humble shape and colour. When cookies went stale or sweet rusks were too hard to eat, they were run through a manual meat grinder until they became a fine powder. This crumbly base was mixed with whatever fat was available, usually butter, a little sugar, and the magical ingredient, a few spoonfuls of dark, bitter cocoa powder. The mixture was kneaded by hand until it formed a thick, sticky dough, and then we helped roll them into small, oblong shapes that looked exactly like dirty potatoes. Placed in the refrigerator to chill and set, they became dense, chocolatey, fudge-like truffles. We did not need fancy French bakeries. The joy of licking the sweet cocoa and butter mixture off our messy fingers while shaping these little cakes with our mothers remains one of the sweetest memories of our lives. Let us shift to a savoury dinner staple that saved the day when the refrigerator was completely empty: save for a few humble items. I am talking about the legendary melted cheese soup. The star of this dish was a small, foil-wrapped brick of processed cheese, usually the famous brand called Druzhba, which translates to friendship. These little bricks cost mere kopecks. You would boil a pot of water, toss in some diced potatoes, and maybe fry a single chopped onion if you had one. Then you would grate that little brick of processed cheese directly into the boiling water. As you stirred, the cheese would melt completely, turning the clear water into a rich, creamy, opaque broth with a beautiful yellow tint. The smell of that warm, savoury dairy broth filling the kitchen was incredibly comforting. It tasted rich and decadent, fooling the stomach into thinking it was eating a rich cream soup, when in reality it was just water, potatoes, and a tiny block of cheap cheese. It was the ultimate comfort food for hard times. Another miraculous transformation of leftover bread was the creation of homemade rye kvass. During the suffocating heat of the summer, buying cold drinks every day was simply too expensive, so we made our own. Those same dried crusts of black bread, especially the ones that got a little too dark and burnt in the oven, were collected in a massive 3-litre glass jar. You added a handful of sugar, a little bit of active yeast, and filled it with warm water. Then you covered it with a cloth and left it in a warm corner of the kitchen to ferment. Over the next few days, the liquid would turn a murky, dark brown, and a distinct, sour, yeasty smell would begin to emanate from the jar. When it was finally ready, it was strained and chilled. Pouring a cold glass of that sharp, tangy, incredibly carbonated homemade kvass was the most refreshing experience in the world. It had a slight bite that tickled your throat, a complex flavour born purely from stale bread and patience. It was the taste of a Soviet summer, crafted carefully by our grandmothers. Sometimes the things we found most delicious were the parts that modern chefs simply throw in the garbage. Do you remember standing next to your mother while she was shredding heads of green cabbage to make borscht or to prepare a large barrel of fermented sauerkraut for the winter? As she chopped away the leafy greens, you would stand there, waiting patiently for the ultimate prize, the thick, pale white core of the cabbage, the kocherishka. She would carefully carve off the tough outer layers and hand you the solid, geometric centre. Biting into that raw cabbage core was incredibly satisfying. It was dense, impossibly crunchy, and surprisingly juicy, with a flavour that was slightly sweet and a little bit spicy, almost like a mild radish. It was nature's own candy, completely free and packed with freshness. We would chew on it for hours, our jaws getting tired, feeling like we had been handed a special secret treat that only children who helped in the kitchen were allowed to enjoy. When we were sick, or when a mother wanted to provide a truly luxurious, silky dessert, without spending a single dime, she would make a gogol-mogol. The recipe was incredibly simple, yet it felt sophisticated. You took 1 or 2 fresh egg yolks, dropped them into a small cup, added a few spoonfuls of white sugar, and then the hard work began. You had to whisk it vigorously by hand with a fork or a teaspoon. You whisked and whisked until your wrist ached, watching the dark yellow yolk slowly lighten, expand, and turn into a pale, thick, creamy foam. The sugar crystals would eventually dissolve, leaving a smooth, incredibly rich and sweet custard. We did not know about the risks of raw eggs back then. We only knew the pure, velvety joy of eating that sweet foam by the spoonful. It coated your throat, which is why mothers insisted it cured a cough, and it tasted like a dream. It was a masterclass in how physical effort and endless patience could transform the most basic ingredients into pure culinary gold. There is a soup that brings back very complicated emotions for many of us, but thinking about it now fills us with a profound, aching nostalgia. Milk soup with vermicelli pasta. It was the absolute standard dinner for small children. You would boil milk, add a tiny pinch of salt and a spoonful of sugar, and toss in handfuls of thin, short pasta. The kitchen would smell intensely of hot, sweet dairy. The challenge, of course, was the skin that formed on top of the boiling milk. We would meticulously try to push that skin to the side of the bowl. But underneath that dreaded skin was a warm, sweet, comforting broth filled with soft pasta. It was a dish that represented safety. When you came home from a freezing winter walk, cheeks red and fingers numb, a bowl of sweet, steaming milk soup would warm you from the inside out. We may have complained about it as children, but what we wouldn't give to have our mothers place a warm bowl of it in front of us just one more time. And finally, we arrive at the simplest, most magical memory of them all, a memory that proves that happiness is truly a state of mind. When we desperately wanted a fizzy soda, a Burattino or a Tarhoon, but our pockets were completely empty, we became little kitchen scientists. We would fill a faceted glass with plain water, stir in a spoonful of sugar, and add a single drop of harsh table vinegar. Then, the grand finale. We would take a tiny pinch of baking soda on the very tip of a knife and drop it into the glass. Instantly, the liquid would erupt into a frenzy of white, hissing bubbles. We called it our homemade lemonade, or shipuchka. We would drink it as fast as possible, feeling the sharp, carbonated fizz exploding in our noses and throats, laughing at the tickling sensation. It was literally just water, vinegar, and baking soda. But in those brief, sparkling seconds, it tasted better than the most expensive champagne in the world. It tasted like absolute joy. It tasted like the pure, unadulterated magic of our childhood. Looking back at these 20 memories, a beautiful truth emerges. When we say we miss the garlic bread, the burnt sugar lollipops, or the bubbling baking soda lemonade, we are not really missing the food itself. What we truly miss is the overwhelming feeling of safety, the warmth of the tiny kitchen, and the undeniable presence of our mothers and grandmothers standing by the stove. We miss an era when a piece of bread with oil could make us the happiest people on earth because our hearts were open and our demands were simple. We miss our youth. Thank you for taking this deeply emotional journey back in time with me. If these memories brought a warm tear to your eye or a smile to your face, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video to keep these precious stories alive. And now I want to ask you, what was the one incredibly simple, cheap food that your mother made for you when money was tight? Please write your personal story in the comments below. Let us read them and remember those beautiful days together.